All right, there'll probably be a few more people filtering in, but we can get started. So today we're going to talk about aggregate queries, which is kind of grouping things up instead of pulling all the details. We'll also talk about really quickly about how to put comments in your code and a special type of comment. And then we'll talk about partitions and what that means and how to make your queries more efficient by making use of partitions. And then we'll switch into some ETL stuff and look at how to schedule your jobs to run on their own and how to publish to Windows share folders specifically, which is generally considered the easiest way to publish, other than email, of course. All right. So we'll start with partitions. So last week we learned about the where clause to help us filter down the results in our queries. And we looked at BI metadata quickly, unfortunately, but we looked at BI metadata and we saw that it has tons of information about the tables and what's in them and great search functionality. And what we didn't really talk about is there's some specific information in BI metadata that helps us include special conditions in our where clause so that we filter in a way that makes our query run faster and ensures that they're accurate as well. So in that BI metadata, when you're looking at the main page for a table, in this case it's the D daily orders table, you'll scroll down and you'll find this partition type. And that can be blank or none. It can be hash or it can be range. And what you want to be aware of is any table where it's range partitioned. And if it's range partitioned, then you want to be aware of these partitioned columns just above that. So in this case, there's two columns, region ID and activity day, that are partitioned, or this table is partitioned by. I'm not sure the exact correct terminology, but I assure you I know how to explain it at least. All right, and then this is just like a minor note. Some tables also have some recommended query keys. This one, it's activity day and region ID, just like the partitions, but also marketplace ID. And so it's good to take a look at that because it can give you a hint at does this table have data for multiple marketplaces, and so I should make sure that I'm filtering to the marketplace that's important to me, that type of thing, so you don't get multiple marketplaces. All right, so a little bit more about partitions and how do we make use of them. So when you're writing a query against, in this case, D daily orders, we know that it's range partitioned, and we know it's range partitioned on region ID and activity day. And so we always want to make sure as we're building a query, so I've got kind of the shell of a query here, select from D daily orders, where, and then the first thing I do is throw in conditions on the partition column. So region ID, make that 1 for the North America, and set the activity day to a specific date. And we'll talk about dates in, I think, 2 weeks, so don't worry about the specifics of that. But the homework shouldn't require any use of date functions. But and then I also included a condition on that third column that's not partitioned, but was a recommended query key, just to make sure I'm only getting marketplace 1. So this would ensure I don't get Canada data mixed in with my US data, because they're both in the same region but have different marketplaces. All right.
Is there an instance where you would use where twice?
Not in the same select from.
So it should be where and then.
And or and, yeah, exactly right. So then the next question that comes up is like, okay, how do I know what the values should be for the partition? And the good news is there's only really 3 main. Whoa, what just happened? Oh, I see. I clicked on target.com. Somebody's angry out there. So there's basically 3 columns that you find in like almost every table that are the 3 things that it can be partitioned on. Region ID, so you've got NA, EU, FE, and AS, which is 1, 2, 3, and 4 are the values for those in respective order. You got marketplace ID, which corresponds generally to the website. So 1 is Amazon.com, 2 is Target.com, 7 I think is Amazon.ca, or maybe that's, yeah. Anyway, I get them mixed up. But and then you got legal entity ID, which is in some tables, and that's kind of corresponds to kind of the country. So like 101 is the legal entity ID for the US, for an example. The good news is all three of them have really great wikis. So search for region ID or marketplace ID or legal entity ID, and you'll get, bam, here's all the values and what they mean. And so it's easy to figure out what values to put in your query. The other thing, whoops, I'll go back one. The only other type of field that you will find partitioning on, for the most part, is our date fields. So, which every table may have a different name for the date field. It may be activity day, ship day, order day, but date fields tend to be partitioned as well. All right, and so why is this? Why do we need to do this? Why does it make your queries more efficient? So if we imagine the D-daily orders table is a lot smaller than it actually is, and say this is all the data that's in there. We've got a region ID column with 1s, 2s, and 3s. We've got an activity day column with 3 different dates, the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th of January this year, a merchant column, and a quantity column with various values. So if we wrote a query that said, that was against this table, and we said region ID equals 1, what Oracle does as it's running the query is it looks at those conditions on the partition columns right away and basically throws away anything else in the table right from the get-go that doesn't match that condition. So basically, instead of running through every row in this table saying, is it region ID 1, is it region ID 1, it already knows which rows are region ID 1 because they've been sort of virtually put in chunks, and so just ignores 2 and 3. So you've chopped down the size of the table that you're querying. So that, basically it's down to 3 rows now from. And then if we add an activity day condition, because that's the other partition column on that table, again, it chops the table down to only those rows that match those, because it can apply those conditions without having to actually even query the table. And then merchant ID, that's not a partition. So that will then apply in the standard fashion where it checks every row and is that true, is that true? So that's kind of how it makes your queries more efficient. You're basically ignoring a whole bunch of data in the table and only looking at the rows of data that are relevant to your query. All right. So, and I think in my notes last week I'd meant to say sort of create analogies between Excel and SQL, because I find most people are in this class are pretty Excel savvy. So one way to think about partitions would be like if every tab in an Excel workbook was had just region 1 in one tab, region 2 in one tab, region 3 in one tab, region 4 in one tab. If you put a condition on region, it's almost like you're just deleting those other tabs and you're only looking at the tab that's relevant to you. So you're saving yourself time. And so it's one analogy that might help you kind of think about it. All right. So comments. Some people, lots of people, software developers in particular, like to put a lot of comments in their programming code, whatever language that might be. It can help you later if you come back to the query and can't remember why you put a certain condition in, or it can help someone else if they inherit your queries. And so the way to do that is enclose them between and I can never remember the difference between slash and backslash. So if anybody knows, what's the one that goes that way, that type of slash, and then an asterisk. Is that?
Forward slash.
That's forward slash. Okay, so it's the top that makes, okay. I'll try and remember that. All right, so forward slash asterisk starts your comment, and then anything after that is basically ignored by the Oracle SQL until it gets to another asterisk and forward slash. And so putting that into, yeah, I said that already. All right, so putting that into some sample code. Here I'm putting a comment after this column to say this is the title of the book, because it's a query about books. And another comment down here saying, okay, my condition on GL product group equals 14. That's me limiting it to just books. That way, if someone came in here later, they didn't know what GL 14 meant, they're like, oh, 14 must be books, because that's what the comment says. So it's just kind of a nice sort of leaving breadcrumbs for yourself when you end up with 500 ETL queries and can't keep track of them all. and why you did what you did 2 years ago in that one. So then there's a special type of comment, which breaks the rule that I just said that comments get ignored by SQL. So you'll have to forgive me sort of flip-flopping there. So this is you can use special hints in SQL, and those go in the comments as well. Excuse me. Gosh, my voice is going to go all crazy on me. Sorry about that. So the one that we're going to talk about, there's other ones, but the one that we're going to talk about and that I use in pretty much every select statement or a select clause that I build is the use hash hint. And so they go right after the word select in your query and before everything else, before you start doing columns and things. And it starts just like any other comment, / asterisk, asterisk / kind of encloses it. But the way Oracle knows that there's something important in there is you add a plus after the first asterisk. And then it knows, okay, this isn't just a comment, this is a hint. And then the type of hint, use hash, use underscore hash, and then that's followed, like, as you're finding already probably, like almost everything else in SQL, it's followed by parentheses with important stuff put inside the parentheses. So in this case, we put all the table aliases inside the parentheses. So in this case, we look at our from clause. Our from clause has one table, DMP ASIN's essentials. We've aliased that as DMA, and so in our use hash hint, we put DMA. And basically, it's telling Oracle, before it runs the query, what tables there are, and to use a hash join functionality to join them. And the details are not super important of what it's doing, but it makes your queries run faster in some cases. So it's definitely worth including. I just kind of blindly put it in everything. I've been told there are a few cases where it doesn't make sense to do it, but I haven't run into them yet that I know of. So I teach just blindly putting it in everything. And if you have, if you have more than one table, which we'll talk about next week when we start joining tables together, the only difference is you'll list all of them with commas between them. So like everywhere else in SQL, it's either commas or ands and ors between everything, it seems like. All right. So a little recap of where we've been so far. So we started first week with a select and from. That allowed us to just get some data out of the tables. And then we added the order by clause in order to kind of sort the results for us without having to do it in Excel. Then last week we added the where clause, and that allowed us to filter down the results. And so this week we're going to talk about kind of the next step, which is aggregating those results in SQL rather than having to do it in Excel. And I think of it sort of like there's a subtotal function in Excel that I never ever use. It's sort of like that. It's also sort of like pivot tables, which I use a lot more. You're basically kind of getting rid of all the individual rows of detail and just returning kind of things lumped together at the relevant level for what you're doing. And so we're going to start with just this kind of basic query, region ID and warehouse ID from the D warehouses table. Just saying where region ID equals 2, so Europe, and then ordering in that by region ID. So we're going to play with that table and kind of add some different types of aggregation because there's a few different ways you can aggregate. I guess I'm even simplifying the query further. So the very simplest form of aggregation in my mind is to use this distinct operator function. And it goes, in this case, it goes right after the select and applies to everything in your select clause, all the columns. And it's saying, it's going to, from this D warehouses table, it wants to see all the distinct combinations of columns in your select clause. Here we only have one column, so it's going to be all the distinct region ID values. And we know that there's like 5,000 or something. There's lots and lots of rows in this table. But if we run that, we just get 4 rows of data for the 4 unique region IDs, the distinct region IDs. All right. Then if we add a second column, so in this case we're adding the is dropship field, which is a yes/no field. It provides a list of all the unique combinations So you've got 1 in here twice, 2 in here twice, 3 in here twice, 4 in here once, because it's the combination of the 2 columns. So 1 in, 1 yes, 2 in, 2 yes, etc. And if you had 3 columns, it's the distinct combination of all 3 columns. You'll notice the distinct only goes once at the very start of the select clause. You don't need it on every single row. All right. And I need to click more. All right. All right. So kind of the next type of aggregate function is when probably what you'll use the most, where you want to be counting things or summing things or picking the minimum or the maximum or the average or the median or lots of different things. Standard deviation is one of them, I think. And so in that case, you wrap the column with one of those aggregate functions. So in this case, we're using the count function, parentheses, of course, and then inside the parentheses, the column that we want to count. And so in this case, we're counting region ID from the warehouse IDs column table, and we're just counting it for the whole table, and so we get the result of 5,096 region IDs. You'll notice it's not 4, right? So there's 4 distinct region IDs, but there's 5,096 rows, and today there's probably more because I can't keep up with this table. It's constantly changing on me. All right, so it's basically counting how many non-null values there are in that column. Now, if we really wanted how many unique values there are, and we didn't actually care to get them like we did before by putting just distinct at the start of the select clause, we just wanted to know the number, we can put distinct inside the count function, so preceding the column name, and with a space. And they look kind of tight there, but there is a space between the distinct and FC region ID. So in that case, we just get the 4, so it's found how many unique values there are. And I haven't, kind of talking in that Excel analogy thing, I haven't found a way to do something like that with pivot tables, where you can count, but it always seems to just count how many values there are, not distinct values. So if anybody knows how to do counting distinct and pivot tables, let me know. All right, and so here's a few of the other aggregate functions you can use. Sum, min, max, all used the same way, wrapping around a column. So here we find we get 4 distinct region IDs, 72,406 is the sum of it's not a really relevant measure, but if we were summing, it's a numeric column, so we were able to sum it. And then the minimum warehouse ID, so min and max work on both numbers and dates and alphanumeric varchar fields. So in this case, the alphabetically minimum warehouse ID at the time was A00D, it looks like, and then the largest was Zappo. All right, and so that's great, but sometimes you want to be counting or summing things grouped by something. So a lot more like a pivot table where you have like columns and rows and values. So in this case, if I want to count how many warehouse IDs there are per region, and if I shove region in there as a column, it's not going to work, and it's going to throw this not a single group by function, an error that I anticipate you'll probably get very familiar with, because it's very hard sometimes to keep track of when you're adding things to the group by and all that. But so that's not the way to do it. So don't burn that into your memory. All right, this is the right way to do it. So anytime, and this statement is, I think I put it on that SQL cheat sheet because I remember it. I say it so many times to people. Anytime your select clause has a mix of aggregate functions, counts, mins, maxes, sums, and non-aggregate expressions like columns, like region ID, we're not aggregating that in any way, then you need a group by clause. And your group by clause will contain any and all non-aggregate elements from your select clause. So here we put region ID in the group by because it's not summed, counted, minned, or maxed, and we also have the column that is. And I kept the order by clause in there just to show you where it falls between these two. It comes after the where clause and before the order by clause. All right. And so in this case, the results give us, for each unique region ID, how many warehouses there are. And yeah, like I said, it's kind of like a pivot table. All right. And so this is the way I make sure that I don't get that error. Just one approach. But when I recognize that I have a mix of non-aggregate and aggregate expressions or functions in my select clause, or I get the error saying that that there's a mix, I basically copy the entire select clause. So in this case, the second and third rows there, the first two rows after select, and I paste those into a group by clause. And then I delete any of those that have count, sum, min, or max in them. So I got rid of that count warehouse ID row. And then I remove any column aliases. So backing up a little. Here we've got where we're aliasing region ID as region. So we've got a column alias. Got to get rid of that. You'll get an error that's not very helpful if you leave that in there. I think it'll give you like a SQL command not properly ended or something like that. It's perfectly vague. And so that then sort of back to the correct format. All right, one new clause and one other new clause this week in addition to group by. So sometimes with where clause conditions, you're evaluating usually like if the value in a specific column is equal to something or greater than something. Sometimes you want to restrict your results by the result of a count. So say, I don't know, I should probably skip ahead and see what. All right, so there we go. So maybe we want to limit the results of querying the counts of warehouse IDs by region. We only care about those regions that have at least 100 warehouse IDs. We don't even want to see the lines of data for those that don't. If we put that in our where clause, it's going to evaluate the warehouse ID column and see if the value in each row is greater than or equal to 100, which I don't even know what that would do because it's a varchar field and you're trying to evaluate if it's numerical, and it wouldn't work. So instead we use the having clause, which is kind of like the where clause that runs after it's already done the grouping. So you generally only use a having clause if you have a condition that you want to apply to the results of a count or a sum or a min or max. So here we're saying that we want the results of basically everything above this, take those results and then filter it down to only those where the result of the count of warehouse ID is greater than or equal to 100, in which case we get regions 1 and 2 because regions 3 and 4 have fewer than 100 warehouse IDs. And then after it runs the having clause, it runs the order by clause. And that's the order of these is set, so always shove your having clause between your group by and your order by. All right. Any questions on that stuff before we move on to the other couple topics? Good. I'm making sense today. Good. All right. Target. Yay. Okay. All right. So the other two topics that we want to talk about kind of on the ETL side of things are scheduling your jobs and then publishing to folders. And so both are pretty straightforward for the most part, but not necessarily intuitive. So we'll start with the scheduling your job. So this is just I have this testing ETL profile that I use if I'm just doing a one-off query that I know is going to run a while and just want to throw it in there and see the results and don't want to necessarily make it a formal thing. So that's what we're going to play around with here. And for every job in your job profile, so the good old job section here where you got the user and the group and database and priority and time zone and marketplace in this case. You also have scheduling options that we kind of glossed over on week 1 when we were looking at editing and setting up the job information. So in order to schedule it, we'll click the little edit button. All right, and all this stuff's already set up. We'll scroll down and we get to this job schedule type section. And so you got 4 options. Default is unscheduled, where you have to kick it off manually yourself. Then you can schedule it to run daily, just pretty straightforward. It kicks off every morning as soon as all your tables have loaded. You can also pick weekly, in which case you pick the day of the week, and you can pick monthly, in which case you pick the day of the month. And so let's say this is probably the one I use most, the weekly. And the trick, the little trick, the thing to remember here is this is the day that the query is going to execute. And so if the reason I run things on Sunday so often is Sunday's the first day of the new week, so it's the first day I can get all the data for the prior week. So Sunday's when it's going to execute, it's going to use the run date of the day before, which I'll talk about a little bit more. The monthly even makes that maybe more explicit. So monthly, you can pick the day of the month. If I want to pull all the data for last month, the first day I can do that is the first day of the new month. And so on 3/1/2012, it's scheduled to run, and it's using the run date of this year 2012. And so that's what's going to kind of be plugged in. In a week or two, we're going to start talking about the run date wildcard, which then it gets really important what's being selected either by your scheduled job or you select when you pick that date. Up to this point, I've basically told you just pick yesterday. As we put a wildcard in there that uses that, you can create kind of dynamic date stuff that makes use of that. So for now, it's not super important, but it'll become important as we start to use that. So weekly, monthly, daily. Now sometimes people want to do, maybe they want it to run on Tuesdays and Thursdays. And in that case, let's actually do that one. So I want it to run on Tuesday. So for data up through Monday, we'll save that. So there's no option in a single job to set it up to run on multiple days of the week. But a single profile with the same SQL can have multiple jobs. And so where's that copy button? There it is. So we can just copy this job so we don't have to retype and re-establish all those settings. And then this is, it's giving it, we'll do that. Give it a slightly different name. And then this one I can set up for Thursday. Save that. And then we'll see there's two jobs now both for the same profile. So they're both going to use the same SQL, but they're going to use the values in their own section when they run. And so if you another common use for multiple jobs is if you're running one for Marketplace 1, one for Marketplace 2, one for Marketplace 7, that sort of thing. As well as obviously the scheduling for different days. So we can see there scheduled Tuesday, scheduled Thursday. Does that make sense? Yeah?
When you make a marketplace, when you're using the 1 and 2, that means that you have to have is it called wildcard in the SQL below?
You don't necessarily have to, but if you're using a wildcard, which we'll talk about the marketplace one, I think next week or the week after, if you're using those wildcards, that's when whatever you picked here becomes really important because that's what gets stuck into those places. Yeah, absolutely. And if you're not using the wildcard, then the importance of this is a little bit less, but it is still going to, when it's, when your query goes from new, I guess right after new it goes into checking dependencies and then waiting for dependencies. One of the dependencies is that whatever you picked here, that partition of that table for that date that you picked has loaded. And so it can impact whether your query runs when you want it to run. But most of the time, it's, I ran into that once in the 11 years I've been using the data warehouse, so it's not not usually an issue. All right. Any other questions about the scheduling piece of ETL?
I assume there's no way to accomplish what you just did. So, you did, let's say, Sunday and Thursday or whatever. You can't execute that on the same job profile by actually selecting 2 different days.
No, yeah. Unfortunately, it doesn't let you do a control and select multiple. Yeah, it would seem logical that would be an option. There's only 7 possible values, so at least for the week, it seems logical, but that's not an option, unfortunately. One thing that I'm not sure about, I should know the answer to this. If you set it to run monthly on the 31st, I don't know when that runs in months that don't have 31 days. So it may just run on the last day of the month. I would guess it's that smart, but it might be fun to check. All right. So then the other really big thing is, so far I think, unless you've read ahead or someone tipped you off, so far we've been using the email publisher type for our output, which is great. It puts it in your inbox. It's pretty if it's HTML formatted. But a lot of times, what you really kind of need is, it's a huge file, and huge files you can't really send to your email, or it's not much use to you to have it in your email. A lot of times you want to be publishing the results to maybe a directory folder. And in retail, which is most of my background, those ant dept folders tend to be commonly used. In my new team, it's nobody really even knew there was one, but I've tracked it down because I'm obsessed with them. All right, so we're going to, just like we did with the email, we're going to just click on the new publisher. All right, and this time, instead of selecting email, we're going to select Windows Share, or Windows, oh yeah, it is plural, Windows Share, all one word. All right, and then you can give it a description. I honestly just put like a couple letters in there, because unlike email, where whatever you put there becomes the subject line of the email, here it doesn't really have any relevance. So unless you have multiple publishers, like jobs, where you can have multiple jobs, you can have multiple publishers in the same job profile. So in that case, maybe you'd want to give them all different names. But generally, I picked text, so that's going to give you a tab-delimited text file. Really easy to import into Excel. Really easy for a lot of technical systems to suck into. Encoding, I always leave it as the default. I think I'm going to be learning a little bit more about encoding as I start to support China and Japan. I think it may impact some of the characters, different types of characters. So I'm afraid I don't know what to pick right now if you have other types of characters, but for now I'd say just pick the default and we'll learn together. All right, and then your Windows share path, it's as easy as picking, say I go into Windows Explorer and I navigate to a spot, and this is the folder I want it to go in. I literally just copy that, paste it in there, make sure it didn't get an extra space at the beginning. Nope. All right, and that's the folder. And then you also need to give it the file name. So I'm just going to call it file name. And then you have to give it the extension as well. So in this case, it's tab-delimited text, so .txt. And so it's kind of exactly, it's called a Windows Share Publishing because it's exactly what Windows Explorer would tell you is the path to that file. And then we can hit save. All right. And then I'm going to go into this job performance history through that stopwatch. I do not want to publish that again. That was a big mistake. I'll see if I can publish this one again. So I'm going to click on this job run. All right. And then I'm going to, now that I've changed the publisher, I want to republish so that it publishes to that file now. So I'll click on this since it's in success, and because it's fairly recent, I think. I didn't run it that long ago. Usually for about a couple weeks, you can republish the results of anything, so if you need to change a publisher. Hopefully that works. You always have to give it a reason. My favorite one as a kid, because... And so you'll see the job run bounces back to waiting to publish, and hopefully, with a little luck, Not very lucky today, I guess. Let's see if something's going on. Oh, so in the job run, I see that it's creating publishing element at type Windows share, so it's trying. So that's good. So go back to the summary. See if while I was checking up on it, yeah. So there we go. So now it's in success. One quirky thing you'll see is it now adds all the time between the last time it published and now to the minutes run. So it looks like my query took weeks to run, which of course isn't actually what happened. But so don't worry about that if you see that. All right, so now if we go back to that folder, there it is. Yeah, whatever it happens to be. Not very much information at all. All right, and so.
So every time, like, if you have the schedule to run weekly, will it overwrite the same file every time? So
Exactly right. Yep. So every time, yeah, exactly right. Because the file name is a set hard-coded thing, it's gonna just overwrite that file. It has permissions to do that, so you don't have to worry about it trying and failing. The only way it would fail is if you happen to have that text file open when it's trying to publish. It can't delete it and create the new one in that instance. So it'll get an error, but then you can just close the file and hit republish, and you're good. And I'll show you one other trick, and then get to the inevitable sort of that begs the question: what if I don't want to overwrite my file every time, right? So I'll show you one other thing, and then we'll show a way to avoid that. Let's see. All right, I want to go back to profile. So click on the profile ID. So I'm going to edit this publisher. So one thing that I like to do is I basically use the exact same publishing path for every single SQL query that I write, and I use this special wildcard that plugs in. I'm going to go back one here. It plugs in the job profile ID, which can be found in a couple places. So if you're on a job run, it's this number here, this 16. Can't read it at that angle. 1614710. You can also find it if you're on the main page of the job profile. Also, probably even easier to grab. It's the very last number there. If you're not on the job profile, though, the last number there might be the job ID or the job run ID, which are not the same thing. So make sure you're kind of on the main page of the whole job profile, and it'll be that number. So kind of looping back. So basically, I'm going to use a wildcard that makes my file name that number. So since that's a unique number for every job profile will have a unique file name. So you'll notice this is where I dump all my outputs, and they all just have these numerical numbers. One nice thing about that is if I don't know what SQL query produced this text file, that number gets me right to it immediately. If that was just like file name, I'd have no idea what SQL query, what ETL job created that. So it creates a nice connection between the output file and the source ETL job. All right, so enough yammering on about that. So in this case, I'm going to replace the word file name with this special wildcard. And you know what? I'm going to pull it from the place that I always pull it from. There's this DW ETL SQL wildcards wiki, which you can get to from just ETL wildcards too. I bookmark it because I use it all the time, and it has a list of all the different wildcards. And ETL wildcards, they're specific to Amazon's ETL manager. They don't work in Oracle SQL Developer or Toad. It's a sort of yet another homegrown Amazon type thing. And so in this case, we're going to use this job profile ID wildcard. All the wildcards have curly brackets around them, and that's part of the wildcard, so make sure you include that. So I'm going to copy that guy, and I'm going to just replace what was the word. Can I get that a little bigger for you? There, maybe. What was the word file name as the file name? I'm going to just put in that wildcard. And so now this path when it runs, we'll plug in that 16 blah, blah, blah number that we saw was the job profile of this job profile, the ID of this profile. So that's set, and I got to find my save button over there. And, well, it's not very helpful when it's that big when we're on the bigger pages, is it? All right. So then we'll just do what we did before, go back to that job run. We've changed the publisher, so I'm going to hit republish again. And it should pop back into waiting to publish. And hopefully be as prompt or as close to as prompt as last time. Okay, so now it's in publishing, and hopefully it doesn't get stuck. Good, success. And so now if we go back to our folder, we see now the newest file is a file named 1614710, and it's actually overwritten the last time I published to that same path, because that's what used to be my path for that. So now the question, like, what if I don't want to overwrite every time? What if I want to archive a unique file for every run of my ETL query? So there's another wildcard, or two or three or four. We won't go into all of them necessarily, but there's this, one of them that a lot of people use is this job run details wildcard. And you can use it in just the same way. We can go into the publisher, edit the publisher, and then maybe I will there we go, a little easier to read for now. All right, so maybe I'll do an underscore between the profile ID. I like to leave the profile ID because it's that breadcrumb back to the profile that created the output. And then we'll just plug in that job run details wildcard. And then shrink back up, save. We'll publish one more time. Thankfully, it's being pretty good about this so far. Every once in a while, when you're publishing to Windows Share, I find it runs into a problem, and it'll try, and then it says it's gonna try again in 1 minute, and it's gonna try again, and it's like, we're gonna wait 2 minutes this time. Somehow it has an issue connecting, and it'll keep doing that 2 minutes, 4 minutes, 8 minutes, 16 minutes, and then if it fails after the final 16-minute wait, it just errors out, and then I inevitably just hit republish, and it usually works. Basically, there was like a little window of time when it had issues connecting. So if you see that, do not worry. All right, so we've changed our publisher, and we'll republish again, and this time maybe we'll wait over here. Wow, that was fast. So there was the temp file that it was creating, and now it's published the real thing. And so you'll see the difference here between the last time we published with just the job profile ID wildcard, and now the job profile ID underscore, and then the job run wildcard. It stuck two things on there. The first thing it's stuck on is the run date. So even though today's the 9th of March, the data set that we're republishing is from the 26th of February, so it puts that date in there. And then an underscore, and then in this case a 1, because 1 is we picked marketplace as our partition, and marketplace 1 is the value for that. And so that then allows you to, okay, if I have a different run for every marketplace, for every day, it'll do that. If you don't care about the day, but you want marketplace, when we start talking about the other wildcards that are, you can dig into that wiki if you want. There's wildcards for region, marketplace, legal entity. There's a cool free form one that we'll talk about in the future. But you can use all of those in whatever, and you can use them specifically as in your publishing path to get that value into your results. So you'll see these ones I used the free-form wildcard, and I put the day of the week in the free-form wildcard to get a different file for every day of the week. See if there's anything. Yeah, not a ton of examples in this folder because it's my new team. I'm the first one to use it. Does all of that make sense? How to use that? Feel comfortable? One thing with Windows Share Publishing, if you think of data warehouse as a user, data warehouse is a user ID, like mine's dgarling, it's Metron. If Metron doesn't have permissions to publish to the folder that you're telling it to publish in, it's going to run into issues. And I think the other night I sent out a couple wikis that you can use to fix that. It's basically you go to permissions.amazon.com and go to that ant group and ask for permissions for Metron to write to that folder. So, yeah, any questions about anything today or the rapid fire last week? Homework going okay? Yeah, cool. All right, well, thank you.
Yeah.